Kurwa, co ja włączam?
W momencie, kiedy oni widzą, jakby siedzieli koło mnie, to jakbym wziął kurwa jakiegoś motka, to bym mu łeb rozjebał normalnie. Wszędzie zapierdolę za to normalnie.
Witam, panie Remek. Słuchaj, no musimy wyjaśnić sobie parę spraw. Bo tak to masz kosę na to. Tak to nie może wyglądać.
Ja to myślałem, że kurwa niższy jesteś, to ci powiem.
Po całym tym
Ale
chodź stałeś na nogi, nie?
Romu-
Stałeś
Zamknij dziurę, puszczaj.
jakoś to się obeszło.
Ale ty...
Are you alright?
O kurwa.
That portkey take us?
No dziadzio czaruj.
Ice.
Kurwa jak cowboy.
Steady yourself! It can't be.
Jaki paskudny. Tu mój napój przeszkadza. Dobry napój. Jabłko, truskawka i malina, Helena. Piękny klimat, kurwa.
Jaki piękny wieczór, kurwa. O! No i koniec. No i koniec challenge'u.
Ej, muszę wszystkie Harry Pottery obejrzeć. Chyba jutro streama streamu. No dziadzio czaruj. Fajna wrota. Fajne.
That's what you're seeing.
No dziadzio czaruj.
Ice.
Hokus pokus. Czary mary, skurwysyny. Wypierdalać powrowanie. Kurwa, potężny gremlin, ty. Brzydki i potężny. Co tam, Patryk?
Ah, yes. A bit older than the others, aren't you?
To dobrze czy źle, bo nie wiem. Tak przydzieliło. Witam cię, koleżanko.
Jesteś bardzo piękna i ładna. Powiedz mi, z jakiej jesteś miejscowości, jak masz na imię, ile masz lat?
Zamknij mordę, a nie gadasz do mnie. Z tym
I'd like
gościem.
to go with Sebastian.
Jeszcze sobie klientka coś wkręci, kurwa, i się zakocha, później będzie mi dupę truć. Wolę sobie z ziomeczkiem piątkę przybić i iść na piwko.
O, ziomale ponad lale, o.
Pajac, kurwa, w tej, kurwa, ubraniach. O, kotek. Miał. Zajebisty kotek. Aha, czyli najpierw muszę questy u NPC-ów wykonywać, potem mi dają jakiś czar, mnie uczą w nagrodę. No, tak to rozumiem, dobrze? Dobrze? Bo ja nie czytam tego, co tam piszą na dole, tylko słucham, co on mówi, bo to jest bardziej dokładne pewnie niż nasze tłumaczenie. Nie wiem tylko, co to jest, bo jak level mam, to rozdaję gdzieś te punkty, co w level dostałem, czy nie zadanie profesjonalna repero. A co się stało, koleżanko? Komu wpierdolić? Nie wiem, nie znam cię. Gdzie te misje są? Nie zaspoilerował mi, bo i tak mi się podświetla. Bo zobacz, bo on nawet mówi tego questa. Tylko przepowiedział mi, jakiego questa będę miał, ale jak jeszcze raz tak zrobisz Donald, to cię wypierdolę. Dzięki. Póki nie poproszę, nie spoilerujcie, ja też chcę coś sobie wykminić. Skrzynka, jak to otworzyć? Kolekcja, manekin, to na chuj mi manekin, jak to jakiś kurwa nie wiem. Topór, kurwa nie wiem. Miecz. Domyśliłem się, jak się otwiera skrzynki z okiem. Znaczy domyśliłem się. Logicznie myślę, dwa sposoby są. Pierwszy, albo musi być noc, żeby one spały i miały to oczko zamknięte, albo muszą mieć jakiś czar, który mnie oślepie. Ewentualnie ta niewidka pewnie, peleryna też, że mnie nie widziały może, no nie wiem, no mam kilka pomysłów, na razie nie mam pojęcia co. Zobacz, dwie świnie. Bo specjalnie mówi spójrz tam, bo tutaj coś pewnie kurwa ciekawego jest, kurwa chuj jebany, nie chcę koledze powiedzieć, ty, że co to za kolega z niego jest, kurwa. Brakuje mi takiego elementu, że chcę komuś zapierdolić
Czym
4
był
lary.
dziś?
O co chodzi?
Hence the name.
Patrz koleżanko, tak się szaruje. Zobacz, widzisz kurwa?
Repair.
No, pokus, pokus. O, i wypierdalaj do spania. A można mieć kilka różek, czy jak mi się te różki jakoś? Czemu on wszystkie z zielonego pudełka wyjmuje? Sztywne. Musi być sztywna kurwa różdżka. Nie wiem, myślałem nad Feniksem, ale smok jest kurwa to stary i mądry.
That sounds wonderful, Mr.
Dziadzio,
Ollivander.
tu małpeczka jakaś. O, kotek miał. Trzeba pogłaskać kotka.
A co jest increase damage, okej.
Dalać, ja chcę walczyć. Nie działa mi to, nie, co miałem takie... A nie działa na niego ta obrona. Nie działa to na niego. Nie wiem o chuj tu kurwa chodzi. Nie można tu nic zrobić, kurwa tu. Nie mogę uciec. No jak kurwa tego uniknąć? No i nie da się tego uniknąć, nie rozumiem. Tylko mówię, bo problem jest taki, że wcześniej używałem tego czaru takiego ten, że jak mnie coś uderzał, blokowało i uderzało w niego od razu czymś. Teraz to nie działa na tego Gargamela. Hitless! Hitless baby
It's all
jeszcze.
bit of a blur, to be honest.
Officer Singer.
Muszę zbindować ten unik na spacji, a skok na scrollu i będzie okej. Chuj, które lepsze? Które lepsze są? To jaka różnica w tych szatach? Już mnie trochę to wkurwia. Nie, no dawaj, zapierdolę mu różką. Abracadabra na czoło, kurwa, kutasa mu narysuję się
Let's
nauczy.
take our go.
Kiedy będę mógł misję wykonywać sobie? Nie mogę sobie tych misji robić, muszę do tego głąba cały czas chodzić? Wygrać 2 rundy skrzyżowanych różnych. Gdzie to mam kurwa wygrać? I co? Nie rozumiem. Niby mam, ale nie mam tego w wyposażeniu, czy na czym kurwa polega? Usiadł mu dupą kurwa na tej... O, witam kotka żołcznego. Zacznę czarodziej kot. Czy idzie jakoś znaleźć gdzieś napis? Albo rozpiskę odnośnie tego, żeby się dowiedzieć jak to robić.
Ła!
Gdzie kurwa?
Smegma.
Na tym czapie nosić kurwa. Poradniki. Twój stary jest z poradnika gościu. Wypierdalać.
Tak, co?
Obie jebane. Jak zrobić drugi zestaw? Powie mi kurwa ktoś. Mogę z tym czarem skrzynki otwierać? Nie mogłem nic ruszyć, chuj z nimi, śmieciami zrzucili.
We were glad to help.
And yes, I did see swirls of magic everywhere.
Kurwa, zajebane tu wszystko.
My father always says it was my imagination. I was certainly able to.
It was not your imagination.
Percival. Professor Raccoon can see them too. But we've never known.
Maczko, kiedy Need for Speed?
Czytam się.
Where I found the book yet.
Pierdolę was, zaraz mam...
Może po południu, no. Na razie mam fazę na tego, na poe, nie?
Lepsze, no nie? Prawda? Lepsze te zielone. Zobacz jakiś ziom. Yo, motherfucker! Druid buffy dostał. Kurwa, głąby pierdolone. Kurwa, co oni pojebani są? Ale zbufowali druidów.
Poprzedniego odcinka. No okej, spoczko.
Siema.
Nie wiem, co tu sobie jeszcze puścić. Jeffrey Epstein.
Summer 19...
Dun, 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 dun. Dun, dun, dun.
Summer 1940, the United Kingdom is gripped by the fear of a German invasion. France has been defeated, and a German air and seaborne assault on the British Isles looks imminent. As both Britain and Germany scramble to prepare, their air forces fight for control over the skies of Britain. For Germany, victory is essential for an amphibious landing. But even if they do win, could Germany ever really invade Great Britain? By June 1940, Britain is in a deep and growing crisis. German forces have decisively defeated France, resulting in the evacuation from Dunkirk. On June 10th, Germany surrenders following the invasion, while on June 30th, Germany occupies the Channel Islands, British sovereign territory. Britain's pre-war plans did not foresee German-occupied territory from Norway to the Spanish border. In June, Britain's home forces number 15 infantry divisions and 1 armored division, and most are understrength and undertrained. More troops arrive via evacuations, the Commonwealth, and through hasty recruitment, but there's not enough equipment to go around. British forces rush to build chains of pillboxes, mortar emplacements, and fortified houses across the country, especially along the coastal crust and interior general headquarters lines. There are also more novel defenses, such as the flame fugas, barrels of napalm fired at invaders. Pre-prepared stay-behind guerrilla units are expected to hit flimsy German logistical routes after an invasion. There's also a mass recruitment drive for the new local defense volunteers. Within 6 days of its formation in May, 250,000 men outside of conscription age sign up. But with only 70,000 rifles to arm them, they'll use anything to fight. Improvised weapons could be usefully supplemented by a packet of pepper to interfere with the vision of any persistent unwelcome visitor. British fears stem from overestimating German power, especially in terms of tanks, mechanization, and airborne troops. Paratroopers in particular seem to render the Channel impotent as a defensive barrier. A June 1940 pamphlet warns, "Remember that if parachutists come, they will not be feeling at all brave. They will want you to give them food, means of transport, and maps. Do not give any German anything. Do not tell him anything. Hide your food and your bicycles. Hide your maps. See that the enemy gets no petrol." To British leaders, the German plan to dominate Europe is succeeding, and they're next on the list. We may therefore be sure there is a plan, perhaps built up over years, for destroying Great Britain, which, after all, has the honor to be Germany's main and foremost enemy. But Adolf Hitler has no plan for defeating Britain. On November 1939 Kriegsmarine report,
Kurwa, znowu się to spierdoli na pewno.
but was not optimistic about its chances. In early July, Hitler tells his generals he still hopes Britain will surrender. Hitler astonished us by speaking with admiration of the British Empire. He said that all he wanted from Britain was that she should acknowledge Germany's position on the continent. He concluded by saying that his aim was to make peace with Britain on a basis that she would regard as compatible with her honor to accept. But on July 16th, with RAF bombers now striking German targets in Europe, Hitler orders preparations for Operation Sea Lion in somewhat tentative terms.
Jeszcze.
Since England, in spite of her hopeless military situation, shows no
Siemanko,
signs
Sru.
of being ready to come to an understanding,
Ru 222.
I decided to prepare a landing operation against England, and, if necessary, to carry it out. The Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine rush to develop a plan, but all three have different priorities and expectations. The army favors a surprise invasion across a broad front by up to 40 divisions with tanks. A tactical analysis expects the operation to be similar to a large river crossing, in which aggressive spirit prevails. It is assumed
Gdzie gram? No na standardowej tej lidze, nie? Znaczy w sensie takim, że jakby ci to powiedzieć, to nie jest hardcore, tylko ta nowa liga, co wyszła, ta w zwykłej, nie wiem, formie edycji tego typu.
The Navy points out that this is impossible. They don't have the transport to move 40 divisions and want a more concentrated attack to focus resources and evade the more powerful Royal Navy. General Franz Halder angrily responds,
O, dziękuję za followka.
"I utterly reject the Navy's proposal. From the point of view of the Army, I regard the proposal as complete suicide. I might as well put the landed troops straight through the sausage machine." The result is a compromise. The assault force is scaled down to 13 divisions, 90,000 men, landing at 3 main locations isolated from the Royal Navy by mines. Supported by paratrooper drops, German forces would secure a line from Gravesend to Warsash. If successful, another force would land in Dorset and push for Bristol. As the invasion forces
Dover, kurwa, fajnie jak...
German troops, they would push to a new
jak każdy inny run.
encircling London.
Bardzo Iron.
Threatening the capital will lead to capitulation as it had in France. But the plan has many flaws. Surprise is impossible due to tidal variations along the landing beaches, which means invading forces will land at different times. The 12 hours between the first 2 assault waves means defenders and the Royal Navy could isolate the beachheads or mount
Tam gry...
counterattacks.
Powiadomieniach o Fallowie? Nie. No to jest z tego. Bo mam Streamlabs OBS, nie? I tak się samo jakoś ustawiło.
There are a few prototype landing craft in development, but the Kriegsmarine requisitions 2,400 continental river barges as transports to make up a deficit of 1.35 million tons in shipping. Some will need to be welded together to make it across the channel, while many would be permanently grounded after landing.
Dobra, bo też próbuję coś ogarnąć do streamowania. No ja mam Streamlabs OBS, kiedyś miałem zwykłego OBS-a, ale on jest jakiś, nie wiem, dziwny. Bo były na przykład jakieś tam update'y, czy tam coś, cokolwiek tam zmieniali i to się wszystko pieprzyło.
The Luftwaffe lost
Oh,
approximately 3,600 killed or missing, with 1,400 aircraft lost. Most Luftwaffe losses, though, were bombers or transports, while most RAF losses were fighters vital for the defense of Britain. RAF Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding resisted calls to send more RAF fighter squadrons to France once it was a lost cause, but average experience level is low. Technology and tactics are also critical, which is why we talked to military aviation expert Christoph Bergs.
To set a stage for any invasion, the Luftwaffe had to achieve air superiority over Britain.
No, jak w koju mówię.
During battle, both sides quickly realized that, well, the twin-engined fighters, Bf-110s, the dive bombers, the Ju-87s, and the biplanes, Gloucester Gladiators, and all the bombers were very vulnerable. In fact, the highest RAF crew losses during the battle was from Bomber Command, flying missions into Germany. Yet, the battle for air superiority would be largely fought between the fighters, the Spitfires, the Hurricanes, and the Bf-109s. Here, we have, of course, the classic debate, Spitfire versus Bf-109, which was superior. Well, actually, both planes are remarkably similar, with almost equal performance. They had short range, they were fast, they had strong climbs, and technologically sophisticated for the time. Stronger firepower, a better initial dive, and direct fuel injection spoke in favor of the Bf-109. But the Spitfire was better in sustained turns, but it did lack direct fuel injection and heavy firepower. Then there was of course pilot skill and tactics. Though they had taken quite substantial losses,
Długo 2 lata będzie.
Luftwaffe pilots on the whole had
Wiesz?
more combat experience.
2 lata, plus
Preferred
minus.
attacking from above and operated in pairs, so the Rotte, with a 4-plane Schwarm formation. And as such, they actually used the same sort of 2-ship, 4-ship configuration that we RTC use today with modern air forces. The RAF instead flew in a tight 3-plane Vic formation, the standard of the time. Wingmen concentrated on maintaining formation and following the leader. And this made the formation rather unwieldy once in the air and very slow to respond to sudden threats.
Spadasz miłej gry, no.
First, Fighter
Dzięki.
Command was somewhat reluctant to introduce changes and tactical reforms, as retraining takes time that Britain didn't have. And as such, some squadrons started to modify tactics on their own initiative. Yet 3 important elements spoke in favor of Britain. First, we of course have geography. German fighters had limited range, and that limited their combat time over Britain. By contrast, British pilots could land and even resume the fight half an hour later after being, well, refueled and rearmed. Also, British pilots, when in need, bailed out over friendly territory and could thus take up the fight again if they were not wounded, unlike the German pilots who were captured. The second advantage was radar. Now radar, or the chain home radar system, could identify Luftwaffe formations long before they crossed the channel, giving the RAF ample time to scramble fighters. Radar was part of the first sophisticated integrated air defense system, including, of course, next to radar, the ground observers and the filter rooms that would quickly disseminate all that important information to the anti-aircraft batteries as well as the squadron bases.
Jest!
This meant that the Luftwaffe
Sniper
was
ball.
not surprised. Finally, the Luftwaffe was fighting a battle it
No
was
już
not
w końcu
won.
jakąś szósteczkę mam, że
While
tak
it
powiem.
certainly focused on bombers as the main tool of delivering air power, this was very much entrenched in German operational thinking. It had been created mainly for continental operations, as we saw in Poland and France. And over Britain, it was fighting a battle that probably no air force was equipped to win in 1940.
In July 1940, the Battle of France makes way for the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe has approximately 2,200 immediately serviceable aircraft, mostly bombers and dive bombers in Luftflotten 2 and 3 across the Channel and Luftflotte 5 in Norway. They will face off against roughly 640 combat-ready aircraft, mostly Hurricanes and Spitfires, in the 4 main RAF fighter command groups. The brunt of the attack is expected to fall against number 11 group, commanded by New
No
Zealand,
kurwa, chuj mnie strzeli zaraz. No.
with the other groups providing support as needed. From mid-July to
Kurwa!
12th, the Luftwaffe launches the Kanalkampf, the Channel battle. Fighting over the English Channel, they aim to bomb British
O Jezus,
convoys
co ja
and
zrobię.
force RAF fighters into dangerous dogfights over the water. These early air battles disprove some interwar theories on aerial combat, like the idea aircraft equipped with rear gunners outmatch single-seat fighters. British Bolt and Paul Defiance, German Stukas, and
Gau!
110s suffer high losses
Gau!
from modern fighters. Luftwaffe losses outnumber RAF losses, but Dowding realizes he cannot match Luftwaffe raids plane for plane without unsustainably high casualties. Eventually, British convoys stop using the channel and mostly give up the airspace to the Luftwaffe. It appears Göring has won the opening phase. In reality, the RAF recovers and gains new pilots every week, including from the Commonwealth, German-occupied nations, and the RAF Volunteer Reserve. But pilot experience varies greatly. New arrivals have as little as 9 hours flight time in an operational unit, with no aerial combat training. In Phase 2 of the battle, the Luftwaffe targets coastal radar installations, RAF bases, and aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe does knock out some radar stations, but it's hard for them to confirm damage, and they don't target the stations consistently, meaning damage is quickly repaired. As fighting moves over southern England, Dowding only sends up enough fighters to challenge Luftwaffe bombers and disrupt raids. These tactics make the Luftwaffe think the RAF is on its last legs, and Göring plans a knockout blow in mid-August called Adlerangriff, Eagle Attack. From August 13th to 19th, the Luftwaffe launched mass attacks against RAF fighter infrastructure, peaking on August 15th with 1,800 sorties. The skies over southern England are filled with daily dogfights as casualties mount on both sides. A lack of ammunition means combat is often short and sharp. Tracers passed above and below, curving downwards and giving the impression of flying in a gigantic cage of gilt wire. I looked for another target, and a Hun passed just to the right of me and slightly above. I raised the nose, and at about 75 yards, opened fire. After 2 or 3 seconds, the steady rhythm of the Hurricane's 8 Browning machine guns turned into a series of feeble clicks.
Nie no, jeszcze tu musi być, no kurwa.
109s on my tail. So I flicked the Hurricane on its side, skidding and turning until I was going flat out. The Luftwaffe damages several air bases and ammunition depots, but the British repair most of the damage, and the Germans rarely launch follow-up attacks. One experimental unit, Erprobungsgruppe 210, has success using Bf-110s in a ground attack role, but the Luftwaffe resists tactical change. Most Bf-110s remain as vulnerable heavy fighters. Historian Stephen Bungay concludes, had all the Bf-110 crews been retrained to deliver fast, low-level pinpoint attacks in the way that Erprobungsgruppe 210 were, Göring would have had a war-winning weapon in his hands. There are also German intelligence failings. The Luftwaffe loses around 50 planes attacking non-fighter command bases, and they mistakenly assume all RAF strength is concentrated in the south. On August 15th, a poorly escorted force of Heinkel bombers from Norway attempts to raid northern England.
Lightning damage, not the best sense.
British reserve fighters in number 13 group intercept it and destroy almost 20% of the raiders. From August 13th to 19th,
Spell
the
damage?
Luftwaffe
Oh.
loses 363 aircraft, mostly bombers, destroyed or damaged to all causes. The RAF loses just 178. The British are downing German planes, but almost all British losses are fighters, and for the first time, losses are higher than replacements. British men and machines are wearing out. The Luftwaffe, though, is also exhausted. Fighter pilot Ulrich Steinhilper flew 7 sorties in one day. Although most of us were still not outwardly showing major signs of nerves, arguments were becoming more frequent, tempers frayed quicker. The strain of unrelenting frontline flying was beginning to show. However, experience does improve Luftwaffe tactics. They use feints to confuse British radar, and by late August, the Luftwaffe better understands the RAF sector system, hitting fighter air bases like Biggin Hill daily. Squadron leader Deacon Elliott recalls. No sooner had the squadron landed and refueled than the Germans bombed the airfield. This the second time in 2 days running, and the place was a terrible shambles. 29 killed yesterday, another 7 today. The RAF still has more pilots than planes, but numbers are dropping, from 1,400 pilots in July to 1,000 by the end of August. Czechoslovakian and Polish pilots in Britain are now fully mobilized despite Dowding's concerns about language problems. The losses also trigger strategic
Co to
debates
kurwa jest, jakieś
between
kurstwo jebane.
Number 12 Group Commander Trafford Leigh-Mallory, with the support of fighter ace Douglas Bader, believes mass big-wing formations are more effective at countering bombers than Dowding and Park's smaller interceptions designed to preserve strength. But Park argues such formations take too long to form up, especially in number 11 Group, which often only has minutes to respond to raids. Big-wing experiments by the 12 Group are mostly unsuccessful, but the so-called big wing controversy remains a point of contention between RAF commanders throughout the remainder of the battle and beyond. Meanwhile, in German-occupied ports, the invasion armada assembles.
My God.
October 7th, British commanders announce Cromwell, the code word warning of imminent invasion. Their decision is informed by other events. The same day, Luftwaffe bombers shift from attacking RAF bases to hitting London. Some claim the change is because Hitler is outraged by an RAF raid on Berlin, which was retaliation for an earlier, likely accidental bombing of London. Others think Göring hopes to provoke the RAF into a final battle that would damage British morale before an amphibious landing. The result, however, is a reprieve for the RAF. Attacks on RAF bases slow down, and although they're still losing fighters, the infrastructure to replace them recovers. 11 Group Commander Keith Park recalls. On the late evening of 7th September, I flew over London, and I can assure you that the east end of London and the Thames estuary were a grim sight. However, though I felt very angry, I said thank God, because I realized that the methodical Germans had at last switched their attacks from my vital aerodromes onto cities. The battle peaks again on September 15th with 2 massive German daylight raids totaling 250 bombers and more than 300 Bf-109s clashing with 300 RAF fighters. The Bf-109s are now in closer escort roles,
No było blisko, nie powiem, że nie.
and making them more vulnerable. The raids cost the Luftwaffe 80 planes, including 23 Bf-109s, for 35 RAF losses. 2 days later, Hitler postpones the invasion of Britain indefinitely. Heavy fighting continues into October, but German bombers transition to safer, less accurate nighttime operations. By October 31st, Dowding considers the Battle of Britain to be over. RAF Fighter Command loses 449 pilots killed and 1,500 aircraft damaged or destroyed. Luftwaffe losses are 2,500 killed and 900 captured, with almost 2,800 aircraft destroyed or damaged. Most German losses are bombers, whose larger crews account for the higher casualty rate. German bombing kills about 23,000 civilians. The Luftwaffe's defeat has multiple causes, including British radar, poor German intelligence, and tactical disadvantages for Luftwaffe pilots, like fighting over enemy territory. It was also fighting a battle for which it was not designed. The Luftwaffe was influenced by interwar theories on strategic bombardment, but financial constraints and the dominance of the army in the German military resulted in an air force geared more towards supporting ground operations with light and dive bombers. These types of bombers lacked the offensive punch to operate unilaterally. Meanwhile, expectations air combat would be similar to naval combat prioritized more expensive turret-equipped heavy fighters. The Germans therefore lacked the capacity to produce enough single-engine fighters, which proved decisive in aerial combat. Historian Jens Wehner concludes. The Luftwaffe flew many inefficient airplanes, like bombers or Zerstörer, into battle. The existing aerial armament advantage in 1940 remained almost inconsequential. To focus on fighter production, Luftwaffe leadership would have to abandon their doctrine. But this was never considered because the German victories of 1939-40 obscured the weakness of the German doctrine. On a strategic level, Luftwaffe commanders and intelligence were poorly prepared for the task at hand. Whereas in combined air-ground operations, it was often sufficient to attack a target close to the front line once, during the Battle of Britain, RAF infrastructure needed to be hit regularly and deliberately. This the Germans did not do, and as a result, the damage caused was often temporary. The RAF, on the other hand, had been developed to counter the threat of strategic bombers and defend British airspace. Neville Chamberlain deserves some credit for this, as he prioritized funding for single-seat fighters like the Spitfire, partly for financial reasons, while others, including Churchill, favored bombers or heavy fighters. The government also funds and supports radar and the sophisticated system which underpinned RAF fighter command operations. Historian John Reid reminds us of the RAF's readiness. If the David and Goliath analogy is accepted, the former was better prepared and the latter less fearsome than customarily believed. It's often said that victory in the battle prevented an invasion of Britain and its likely defeat, but this is disputed. So did Sea Lion ever stand a chance? Well, it's impossible to say exactly what would have happened had Britain lost the Battle of Britain. Some historians argue that if the full Sea Lion forces had landed in Britain, they could have likely achieved their military objectives, although it remains unclear if Britain would have then surrendered. However, German aerial victory in August and September would not have guaranteed a landing. Firstly, there were only 7 days in those months where the tides were adequate, meaning the Luftwaffe would have to further exhaust itself maintaining air superiority over England until the invasion. With the RAF able to recover in bases beyond Luftwaffe range, that would be difficult. The Royal Navy home fleet also remained a significant threat. With few torpedo bombers, it's unlikely the Luftwaffe would have defeated it from the air. With the Kriegsmarine still recovering from the Norway operation and lacking heavy ships, it was unprepared for battle with the Royal Navy in the Channel. The Royal Navy would have likely swept mine barriers within days, allowing the Royal Navy access to the vulnerable logistical sea routes. They would have lost ships in a risky operation, but stopping or degrading Sea Lion would have far outweighed losses. German planning was also deficient. They hoped to transport around 100,000 men in the first 2 waves with about 2,000 canal barges. During 1944's Operation Overlord, though, the Allies needed 4,000 purpose-built landing craft to ship 132,000 men. At that point, the Allies had the benefit of experience from successful and failed amphibious landings in France, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. In 1940, the Germans had no such experience. German inter-service cooperation, vital for amphibious operations, was hampered by rivalries and Hitler's preference for individual instead of group conferences. It's also likely that some commanders doubted Sea Lion from the start, but didn't want to criticize Hitler's directive, as Vice Admiral Kurt Assmann later claimed. When the time came for the final decision, none of the responsible personalities was ready, despite his knowledge of the weighty matters at stake, to take a firm stand against the operation. All, however, were inwardly relieved to be able to find, in the lack of air mastery, a sound argument which would openly justify them in abandoning the operation.
Co tu się kurwa dzieje?
Even if Germany could invade, would they have tried? The occupation of Britain, not guaranteed to be short or easy, would be a considerable drain on resources at a time when Hitler was shifting his attention east. From a German perspective, invading Britain was not a necessary prerequisite for invading the Soviet Union, and might even prevent it. By December, Hitler is already making plans against the Soviets, and unlike the cautious phrasing of Directive Number 16, Directive Number 21 is forceful. The German Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign, even before the conclusion of the war against England. For this purpose, the army will have to employ all available units. So, as 1941 looms, Britain is still in the fight, and with Hitler's obsession with the Soviet Union pushing towards a massive escalation in the war, Germany will soon find itself fighting the two-front war it desperately wants to avoid. The Battle of Britain, especially in the UK, is the struggle of the few, a handful of fighter pilots against the mighty Luftwaffe. But this narrative often leaves out the roles of bomber crews, coastal command, the observer corps, radar operators, plotters, ground and repair crew, and aircraft gunners, and air raid wardens, among others. If you want to learn more about
war inside my head,
the intricacies of Britain's radar and their strategic interception system, you should check out the Battle of Britain documentary series by Real Engineering. Using state-of-the-art 3D animations and primary accounts, this documentary series is a deep dive into often overlooked aspects of the battle. And if you want to learn more about the massive logistical effort behind the Second World War's biggest amphibious operation and why it succeeded where Operation Sea Lion never stood a chance, you should also check out Real Engineering's Logistics of D-Day series. And where can you and Logistics of D-Day on Nebula, a stream we're building together with other creators, and where we don't have to worry about YouTube's almighty algorithm or advertising guidelines. On Nebula, you can watch exclusive content like the Battle of Britain or Logistics of D-Day, or our World War II documentary series 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland 45. And all that is available
Rhineland
in 4K resolution and also can be
45.
watched on your smart TV or phone. If you sign up at nebula.tv/realtimehistory, you can get Nebula for just $30 for an entire year. On Nebula, we and other creators also upload our regular videos ad-free and earlier than on YouTube. So you could watch Real Engineering's deep dive into the Spitfire on Nebula too. Again, that's nebula.tv/realtimehistory for just $30 while also supporting this channel. As usual, you can find all our sources in the video description below. Don't forget to check out our video on the Battle of France if you want to learn more about the lead up to the Battle of Britain. If you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that's stockpiling pepper for persistent, unwelcome visitors. On April 18, 1942, American B-25 bombers take off from the aircraft carrier Hornet in rough seas to strike an unexpected blow at Japan, revenge for Pearl Harbor. After hitting Tokyo, the planes will land in China, which finally has powerful allies in its now 5-year-long war against Japan. But those American bombers over the Pacific mean China and its new alliance face tough times ahead. The American Doolittle bombing raid of April 1942 does relatively little damage in Japan, other than some hits on the Japanese carrier Ryu.
No i fajny, kurczę, lucik jest
and military after
tego
Pearl
typu.
Harbor, and an embarrassment for the Japanese, especially the army, which was responsible for the defense of Japan's skies. And the army has been having a hard time for years, as it was bogged down in a 4-year-old war and occupation of China even before Pearl Harbor. Despite the brutal Japanese occupation and the creation of Japanese-controlled puppet states, the Chinese haven't broken. The nationalists and communists created a fragile united front and were now allied to Britain and the United States. The start of the Second World War in Asia meant that the Sino-Japanese War, raging since 1937, merged with the global war as part of the China-Burma-India theater. Doolittle's modest raid was a sign of the alliance China had been hoping for, but immediately it was a double-edged sword. The Americans only informed the Chinese about the raid a few days in advance, and Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek worried his army wasn't prepared if the Japanese wanted revenge against China for allowing American planes to land there. The ground war actually started well for nationalist China in 1942 as they stopped a major Japanese push towards Changsha in January. But just as Chiang had feared, in May 1942, Tokyo ordered a rushed attack on the regions of Zhejiang and Jiangxi to capture the Doolittle airfield and to punish the Chinese. The commander-in-chief of the China Expeditionary Army will begin the operation as soon as possible. He will concentrate on the annihilation of the enemy and the destruction of key enemy air bases in the
Pojebie mnie
Xinjiang
zaraz,
area
no.
in order to crush the enemy's plans to conduct aerial raids upon the homeland from this area. They even brought back some of the air power that they'd moved to the Pacific. Operation Say Go begins May 15th as 140,000 Japanese troops under General Shinroku Hata attack 260,000 Chinese troops under General Gu Zhutong. Two Japanese armies moved to capture the airfields at Lishui, Chuxian, and Yushan, along with the town of Qinhua and critical railways. The nationalist armies in the Third War Zone resisted and even counterattacked, but between May 28th and June 12th, Japanese troops took Qinhua, Linchuan, Chuxian, Yushan, and Nancheng. The Japanese didn't have enough troops to keep all the territory and withdrew in August, leaving garrisons to ensure they controlled local sources of copper.
Kurwa, ja ich nastrzałem, one mnie nastrzała.
The Japanese
Skurwysyny.
advanced left a trail of destruction behind it. Anyone they suspected of helping the downed American aircrew was tortured or killed. They looted locomotives, rail cars, and medical supplies, slaughtered livestock, burnt crops.
To mnie zabiło, okej.
By some estimates, up to 16 million refugees fled, and Japanese atrocities, hunger, and disease killed about 250,000 Chinese civilians in the offensive. Japanese atrocities and sexual crimes in Nancheng were such that witnesses drew comparisons to the infamous rape of Nanking from 1937. The Japanese burned the town before they left, just as they burned Yushan for having hosted a parade in honor of two American flyers whose planes had crash-landed there. As the Japanese withdrew, biological warfare Unit 731 prepared anthrax, cholera, and typhoid germs, which Japanese troops used to contaminate drinking water and food that they left behind. He Fuxin's family was infected with anthrax.
Anthrax?
In August 1942,
Kurwa, tornado sobie wymyślili.
6 out of 7
Skurwysyny.
members of the family were infected by ulcerative skin lesions on the legs with
No,
pneumonia. In the beginning, there were itching and burning blisters on the
co ja mam
legs.
powiedzieć na ten
Then, about
temat,
5 days
kurwa.
later, our legs
Tu
began
laguje
to
jak
ulcerate
chuj, no.
and
Ten
black
shader, nie wiem czemu
blood
ten shader
dropped
taki
off
pojebany.
all day. The skin around the wound was as black as charcoal. My grandparents, parents, and aunt all died of it. Only 2 in my family survived. It's not clear how many Chinese they killed, but they unintentionally killed about 1,700 fellow Japanese soldiers. Tamura Yoshio, who worked on plague experiments at the unit's location in Manchuria, recalled the mindset. I had already gotten to where I lacked pity. After all, we were already implanted with a narrow racism in the form of a belief in the superiority of the so-called Yamato race. We disparaged all other races. If we didn't have a feeling of racial superiority, we couldn't have...
Kurwa jebana.
The Japanese offensive also complicated Chinese logistics, as it made transporting grain from the fertile Sichuan province more difficult. To add to China's troubles, the Japanese had cut them off from Allied help in Burma.
Pierdo.
In December 1941, the Japanese invaded British-controlled Burma. One of their goals was to cut off the Burma Road, China's only supply
Nie,
route
kto to
to
wymyślił,
the
te kurwa
States,
tornado?
Japan had occupied Chinese ports, and to threaten its southwest provinces. The anti-imperialist Chiang didn't trust the British, but offered Chinese troops to help. At first, the British refused as they worried about Chinese influence in Burma. The Japanese, though, bombed Allied airfields and Rangoon and gained the support of Burmese dissidents of the Burmese Independence Army. The British immediately accepted Chiang's help, and 2 Chinese armies with 40,000 men arrived in Burma. They were the best troops that Chiang had, German-trained and partly motorized with Italian and French-built armor. Japanese troops pushed British-led forces, including Indian and Burmese units, back towards Rangoon, and the Japanese used captured airfields to get the upper hand in the air, despite the efforts of the RAF and the American volunteer group better known as the Flying Tigers. Disorganized Allied units retreated towards the Sitang River, pursued by Japanese units, pushing their men to the edge of their strength and into the fog of war. Japanese Private Shiro Tokita was in a position on a hill overlooking the critical bridge across the river. The hill was uneven in contour, and we could see little of our fellow soldiers. Second Lieutenant Kiyuchi suspected that our own guns might be shelling us, and held a Japanese flag high, trying to communicate with the battery. A piece of shrapnel hit his head, and he died. It was unfortunate that we'd not carried steel helmets, in order to reduce our load in crossing the difficult terrain. British engineers blew the bridge before most of the Indian 17th Division could cross, and the result was a disaster. Here there was chaos and confusion. Hundreds of men throwing down their arms, equipment, and clothing and taking to the water, some bringing their arms with them on improvised rafts. As we crossed, the river was a mass of bobbing heads. We were attacked from the air and sniped at continuously from the east bank. The Japanese took Rangoon March 7th and then pushed north as Allied leaders argued. Chiang's new American Chief of Staff, General Joseph Stilwell, wanted to counterattack. But Chiang knew he couldn't afford to lose his best units, and would only commit to a counterattack if the British and Americans did too. Instead, new British commander William Slim and the Chinese agreed they should withdraw, then strike the Japanese when the logistics were stretched. A plan Stilwell considered craft tactics. Chiang eventually allowed his troops to move south to support a British counterattack. But by this point, Japanese reinforcements had arrived and they were too strong. They pushed back the British again and threatened to surround the Chinese 200th Division at Tungu. Chinese General An Yan-tai knew he had to get out of the trap, but Stilwell insisted he stay put, which would probably lead to the division's destruction. So Tai obeyed Chiang and left just in time. Stillwell was livid. Incompetence, lethargy, and disregard for orders amounting to disobedience on the part of Chinese division and army commanders. Unfortunately, my powers stopped well short of shooting. In March and April, the Japanese advanced into North Burma. They took Lashio on April 29th and cut off the Burma Road, forcing British and some Chinese units west into India and the rest of the Chinese forces east into China. Huge numbers of refugees, mostly Indians, struggled through the jungle to make it to safety, with tens of thousands dying on the way. Stilwell wanted all the Chinese to withdraw to India, and himself left the Chinese army for the Indian border, a move Chiang saw as a betrayal. Burma was a disaster for the British, but an even worse catastrophe for the nationalist Chinese. Chiang's best troops suffered heavy losses for nothing, and China's last link to its allies was gone. The air supply route over the Himalayas, known as the Hump, couldn't handle anywhere near the amount of supplies that the road had done. The Burma debacle revealed just how strained inter-allied relations in Asia were. The US, UK, and nationalist China had different objectives in the Asian theater. The Chinese wanted to reopen the Burma Road, but the most influential American figures like General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz focused on the Pacific, with China serving a secondary purpose of tying down Japanese troops. Chiang asked for 3 American divisions, 500 US planes in China, and 5,000 tons of supplies a month, but US support never met his demands. Relations between Chiang and the British were also poor. The British priority was defending India, which made the Chinese and Americans suspicious of British imperialism. Chiang had risen to power as a nationalist revolutionary, so he suspected the British simply hoped for others to fight so they could keep their empire. The UK is engaged in a conspiracy to sacrifice others for its own benefit.
Friends with benefits.
Chiang also met with Gandhi and other Indian anti-colonial leaders, which angered Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Another problem centered on General Stilwell. He was Chiang's chief of staff and overall US commander in the theater, which created tensions. Stilwell had no command experience.
Poison, I'm on the map.
Chiang, of course, had other ideas. Stilwell was important as a link to a crucial ally, but Chiang had no intention of letting him control the army. Stilwell misjudged Chinese capabilities
Russian
and
pubes.
failed to see nationalist strategy from the perspective of its longer war against Japan and the civil war against the Chinese communists. Stilwell and Chiang detested each other. Stilwell referred to Chiang as peanut and even called him an ignorant, illiterate, superstitious peasant son of a bitch. Stilwell also entertained the idea of a contingency plan to assassinate Chiang if the need arose. Even amongst the Americans there were issues. The two top Americans in China, Stilwell and General Claire Chennault of the Flying Tigers, later absorbed into the 14th Air Force, didn't have the same strategic vision. Stilwell wanted US ground troops in China, and he wanted direct control over Chinese armies.
No i takie coś mi się podoba.
American air power should be the main US contribution to the
Define.
war in China, and with enough of it, China could be the base from which US bombers could strike at Japan. As if that weren't enough, the multiple American intelligence and special forces operations in China engaged in a turf war with each other and with Chiang's security services. As Allied leaders argued, the Chinese population was suffering and the nationalist Chinese state was collapsing. The global war put incredible pressure on an already weak nationalist government, institutions, and state infrastructure. Supplies from Burma had been cut off, 50 million refugees had fled Japanese occupation, and public institutions like schools and hospitals were barely functioning. Inflation was rampant and wiped out the savings of many middle-class Chinese who'd supported the nationalist vision of a modern China. Chiang's government desperately needed to pay for and feed its army, but inflation meant that soldiers' salaries couldn't even cover basic necessities. The nationalists imposed a grain tax on peasants to feed the army, which deprived farmers of food stocks and income. In the face of the crisis, the nationalists turned away from their more moderate policies and towards the use of state terror by the security services to stifle dissent. This alienated many intellectuals who supported them before. The suffering of nationalist China also led to the Henan famine in 1942 and 1943. Drought, corruption, incompetence, and a poor transport network meant that millions of peasants starved, even though there was grain available in neighboring provinces. It was so bad that many sold their children to buy food, and there were widespread reports of cannibalism. Government official Zhang Zhonglu witnessed the disaster. During our trip to Henan, starving people were digging up grass roots, taking leaves, and stripping bark from the trees. Going south from Zhengzhou, an unceasing stream of refugees begging for food was so misery-inducing that you couldn't
56%, 23%.
About 4 million Chinese
nie, to jest
died
dobre,
in the
dobre.
Henan famine. Nationalist China was coming apart. Chongqing was losing its grip on power, and society was losing its very humanity. Meanwhile, the communist-controlled areas were experiencing a political revival. In
Przydałoby się
1943, the regions
to
under
zmienić.
communist control inside China also faced terrible conditions. Rampant inflation,
dobra.
poverty, and the danger of famine. But here, Mao's relatively effective progressive tax and land policies avoided the extreme fate of nationalist China, helped by the fact that, unlike the nationalists, the CCP didn't have to pay for a large standing army and didn't play a main role fighting the Japanese at this time. The communists did grow their guerrilla Red Army up to 500,000 troops and militiamen, and set up bases in remote areas behind enemy lines that Mao referred to as, quote, the buttocks of the revolution. These bases were more about the future resumption of the civil war against the nationalists, and communist forces avoided major combat with the Japanese and the nationalists for now. Our line is to wait for improvements in the situation. In the meantime, we preserve our strength while carrying out guerrilla operations employing every sort of tactic, from fierce skirmishing and non-violent revolutionary duplicity to maneuvers against the enemy.
Oh, to Relakish.
Mao used this breathing space to set up propaganda outlets in nationalist-held cities where communist propaganda successfully gave the impression the communists were winning their guerrilla campaign against the Japanese. Mao also renewed his grip on the party. In February 1942, he launched the Rectification Movement, a radical program to instill discipline and ideological unity. His main targets were intellectuals who criticized him, like author Ding Ling, and prominent party members who'd been to Moscow, the so-called 28 Bolsheviks, like Wang Ning. Mao was clear about his targets. Intellectuals who want to serve the masses must go through a process in which they and the masses come to know each other well. This process may, and certainly will, involve much pain and friction. Communist security chief Kang Sheng oversaw a system of false accusations of spying for the nationalists and widespread torture, and Red Army troops restricted the freedom of movement in Yan'an. Even regular soldiers and civilians had to study Mao's texts. This was to be the dry run for Mao's planned reforging of Chinese society once the Civil War restarted, and a foreshadowing of the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and 70s. According to historian Rana
Skurwysyny.
the war against Japan was giving birth to Mao's China. Since the nationalists were exhausted, the communists lying low, and Japan had transferred forces to the Pacific, the front line stagnated in 1943. At a key imperial conference in September, Japan shifted to a more defensive strategy focused on protecting the home islands and oil reserves in Southeast Asia. As for China, this so-called new operation
O, jest rezystant,
would
kurwa.
require the following. Preservation of the status quo in China, while increasing pressure against the enemy to destroy his will to fight. In North China, preparations would be made to meet the contingency of Soviet-American cooperation, but no step would be taken that might bring the Soviet Union into the war. But the status quo in China didn't mean no fighting. The Japanese attacked towards Changsha again in May and towards Changde later in the year, but they didn't have the men to hold any of the gains they did make. American air power, including newer P-51 fighters, played an important role in helping the nationalists stop these Japanese operations based on intelligence from Chinese informants behind Japanese lines.
Yeah,
They were
grość.
particularly successful hitting Japanese targets in Dongting Lake in 1943, when the opportunities arose. Where the Yangtze River came into the lake, there was a Japanese supply collection point. We used napalm and white phosphorus and bombs. Their forces burned for 3 days. It took a month for the Japanese to resupply. Japanese offensives worried the weakened nationalists, though, who considered leaving their capital Chongqing. Chiang even asked what peace terms the Japanese might offer, but these were too harsh. In Burma, the British launched limited attacks and raids, but failed to open up the Burma Road since Europe and the Pacific took precedence. American troops and local workers began to build the alternative Lido Road, but that would take time. On the diplomatic front, Japan hosted a conference in November for members of the so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Tokyo granted Burma nominal independence and tried to legitimize Wang Jingwei's puppet Chinese state with a treaty.
Pozdro.
Japan also recognized the India movement of Subhash Chandra Bose in November 1943.
Szpaszcien.
Japan's intentions were to weaken the Allies and create regimes under its control while appealing to the desire of many Asians to throw off European rule. The Allies, meanwhile, were also strategizing, which would turn out to be a disappointment for nationalist China. Chiang lobbied
Nationalist.
hard for the Allies to prioritize China. His wife, Song Mei-ling, addressed the U.S. Congress pleading for more aid, and Chiang attended the Cairo conference in November 1943 alongside Churchill and Roosevelt. The resulting Cairo Declaration expressed Allied intentions to liberate Asia and restore Japanese-controlled territories to the Republic of China. Allied planners also agreed to a major offensive in Burma for 1944 to reopen supply lines to China, with the U.S. training and equipping Chinese forces in India. 1942 and 43 had seen more devastation in China, and although it now had powerful allies, it was isolated.
Dany.
The nationalist state was crumbling, even as its army fiercely resisted.
Kurwa, co jest?
While communists were conserving their strength for a future reckoning. The Cairo Declaration seemed to offer
Nie, co jest?
but some influential Allied leaders and officials still had doubts about Chiang's China. They felt it was weak, corrupt, undemocratic, and some, including Churchill, dismissed it as a great power. Just days after Cairo, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at the Tehran Conference, where they agreed to prioritize the European theater again. China once again took second place in Allied grand strategy, and Chiang felt betrayed. He predicted that Japan would launch a major offensive since China had been deprived of Allied support, and 1944 would prove him right. 1944 would also see another important outcome of the Tehran Conference. The Western Allies agreed to land in Normandy and open another front in the European theater of World War II, and not even a year later, the Allies were standing on Germany's borders in the east and in the west. If you're interested in the final offensives of the Second World War in Europe, we produced 2 epic World War II documentaries about them. The first is 16 Days in Berlin, the most detailed documentary about the Battle of Berlin ever produced. A 4.5-hour, day-by-day breakdown of one of the biggest battles of the entire war.
Kurwa
The
mać.
Red Army advanced from the Oder River into the heart of Nazi Germany's capital. The second is a 3.5-hour documentary called Rhineland 45, about the last set-piece battle on the Western Front in which the Allies, under Bernard Montgomery, attacked from the Dutch border and ultimately crossed the mighty Rhine River. Both documentaries were filmed on original location, featured detailed maps,
Kurwo ty jebana.
expert and veteran interviews,
Ja
and
pierdolę.
but you can't watch 16 Days in Berlin and Rhineland 45 on YouTube because of our uncompromising portrayal of the war using authentic combat footage. So where can you watch these 2 massive documentaries with a combined runtime of over
Co jest?
on Nebula? A stream
Ja pierdolę, co się dzieje?
creators where we don't have to worry about YouTube's advertising guidelines and the almighty algorithm. If you sign up at nebula.tv/realtimehistory, you can watch all our content in 4K, ad-free, and earlier than on YouTube. And not just in your browser. Nebula is also available on your smartphone and devices like Apple TV or Roku. And all that for just $30 a year. Nebula also features other
Very
series
fucking
exclusive
doors.
productions, like the Battle of Britain series by Real Engineers. Everything Nebula has to offer with your family and friends, Nebula is now offering annual gift cards. Visit gift.nebula.tv/realtimehistory to give a year of Nebula to a friend for just $30. Whichever option
Very
you choose,
fucking
signing
dollars.
up directly or gifting a year of Nebula to someone else will also support this channel. We hope you enjoy our ongoing series about the Second Sino-Japanese War, and be sure to check out our previous episodes. In the next video, we'll cover the largest Japanese offensive of the entire war and Allied victory in China. As usual, you can find all our sources in the video description below. If you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel run by a bunch of peasant bastards.
Go!
In late April 1975, dramatic images from Saigon are beamed across the world. North Vietnamese troops have entered the South Vietnamese capital and proclaimed final victory. U.S. forces are nowhere to be seen, having withdrawn 2 years prior.
Wróciły chłopaki,
Despite their
okej.
absence, the fall of Saigon is seen as a major U.S. defeat, a defeat which has spurred long and still unresolved debate. Just how did the U.S. lose the Vietnam War? In March 1973, the U.S., North and South
Fucking
Vietnam
Causeway.
signed a peace agreement, and the U.S. military presence is reduced to a small Marine detachment at the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Almost immediately, both North and South Vietnam violate the Paris Peace Accords. The North still feels it has the military advantage, while Southern President Nguyen Phan Thieu refuses to deal with communists in a Council of Reconciliation. Fighting also continues. South Vietnamese ARVN forces move into contested zones, although the North avoids large-scale combat to
North
avoid
of
provoking a US
Cox.
return. However, it
Big,
does
big, big.
re-equip its units with modern equipment and heavy weapons and infiltrates more forces into the south in violation of the agreement. A US return
Kurwa,
vote
spróbuj mi
is unlikely.
zginąć.
Congress and the public
Ja
oppose
pierdolę, co? A to ten, okej. Co mnie uderza, to...
Both parties passed legislation limiting presidential power, ordering an end to the bombing of Cambodia and slashing funds to South Vietnam. The Watergate scandal, which reveals Nixon illegally spied on rivals, further limits his influence. Facing impeachment, Nixon resigns in August 1974, but new President Gerald Ford promises to continue to support South Vietnam.
Wow! Szteta, arbalieta.
The presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The North now steps up military actions, capturing Long in December. The ARVN response is lackluster, so the North intensifies operations in March 1975. They expect the new Ho Chi Minh offensive to be victorious in 1976, but victory comes much, much sooner. Following diversionary attacks, the North captures Guan-Mei-Tuot in a surprise raid. Thieu orders a retreat from the central highlands towards Saigon, but it soon becomes a rout. ARVN units collapse as the NDA advances along the coast before swinging towards Saigon. The ARVN hold out at Xuan Loc, but the NDA pushed them back after 12 days of fighting. North Vietnamese forces now attack Saigon. There's a strange, sad giddiness in Saigon. Like the feeling one gets when the score is 56-0 late in the fourth quarter and your team is the one with 0. You aren't happy about the thrashing your team got, but at this point the most merciful thing is for the game to end. There is no US military response, and Thieu resigns on April 21st. Instead, Ford prepares for final evacuations. These become chaotic scenes as thousands of South Vietnamese civilians descend on the airport, which is under attack. The airplane started to move with the door still open. I was looking out the door and saw people running around in all directions, shooting crazily into the air. They seemed to be in a panic. People all around me on the airplane started screaming and crying. Some of them started praying very loudly. The chaos shuts down the airport, the civilians and break in just as the final helicopters depart. The US evacuates 1,000 Americans and 5,500 Vietnamese in 2 days.
Because Vietnamese people all the favor for 425 years now. So now we just stop by,
Hey.
Shortly afterwards, North Vietnamese units enter Saigon to little resistance. On April 30th, NVA tanks crash through the gates of Thieu's presidential palace and the South Vietnamese government surrenders. By May 3rd, the North clears the final areas of the Mekong Delta and the war is over. In 1976, the North announces a unified socialist Saigon renamed Ho Chi Minh City. For the US, their long involvement from at least 1950 is over. For North Vietnam, the struggle for independence arguably started in 1858 against the French. Until 1973, 2.7 million US personnel served in South Vietnam. Of this number, more than 58,000 are killed and 300,000 wounded. The cost of $1 trillion in today's value also led to a
89% critical strike chance.
in the 1970s. Counting Vietnamese casualties is harder. Fighting and bombing kills up to 2 million Vietnamese civilians and perhaps up to 1 million North Vietnamese military
Nie, to będzie
personnel.
spoko, myślę.
The US estimates around 250,000 South Vietnamese military killed in action. But the Vietnam War's legacy goes further than combat casualties. After victory, Northern agents forcibly moved some Vietnamese into so-called re-education camps, perhaps 200,000, though estimates vary. There are reports of political executions of Southern figures, but their scale and frequency remain debated. Vietnam does suffer great economic damage as well. Around 10% of South Vietnam's agricultural land is destroyed, including by US defoliants like Agent Orange. Some also associate these herbicides with an increased rate of cancer and birth defects among both Vietnamese and US veterans. Meanwhile, the North imposes a
I am complete. Well,
not all within the Viet Cong's Provisional Revolutionary Government were communist, and some expected a more pluralistic system. Now, with total power in their hands, they began to show their cards in the most brutal fashion.
strength
It understood
with
that the
staves.
Vietnam of the future would be a single, monolithic bloc, collectivist and totalitarian, in which
Kurwa
all
chujnia jest
traditions and
barszcz,
culture
za
of the South
przeproszeniem,
would
ale
be ground and molded
jest tak
by the
chujowo.
political machine of the conquerors. Economic restructuring and post-war tension with China caused 2 million Vietnamese to leave by 1979, including many ethnic Chinese merchants. Many escaped by sea, becoming known as the boat people.
Nie, może to damy, no przecież dziś critical strike czy increased armor, two-handed weapons. Ja mam tylko one-handed? Czy się liczy jako two-handed? Zobaczymy.
The legacy of Vietnam also continues in the US. Even today, some struggle to come to
955.
terms with high casualties, expense, and domestic turmoil.
986.
There's even debate about whether the US lost the Vietnam War at all.
Dobra.
Nixon felt his agreement provided peace with honor and later claimed we had won the war. Critics, though, point out the peace agreement included major US concessions while allowing the North to keep military forces in the South.
In the fucking South.
Complained the deal amounted to surrendering the field to the enemy and the de facto end of South Vietnamese sovereignty. Secretary of State Dean Rusk called it, quote, a surrender. Others, like Nixon's Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, point out that Washington didn't really expect the South to last, and the agreement was designed to cover a US withdrawal with some semblance of respectability. We know the goddamn agreement will probably not work, but we've got to be in the position where if it doesn't, it will be the result of the other side.
If it doesn't,
this was clearly not a US victory, but a strategic defeat, as historian Gregory Daddis concludes. True, the US withdrawal advanced as a matter of policy rather than collapse. Yet judged on what it left behind, one seems hard-pressed to argue the US military won its war.
Won its
So
war.
why did the US fail in Vietnam? Debate also rages on this question, with a person's position often differing based on their professional role, political background and beliefs, and proximity to wartime decision-making. Some see the roots of US defeat in a failure of execution in Vietnam. This viewpoint often suggests US intervention in Vietnam had good intentions, but practical problems, strategic errors, and poor judgment hindered operations. Later in life, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara outlined a long list of causes for the US defeat, focusing on US hubris, a lack of understanding of Vietnamese history, and over-reliance on military might. General Westmoreland's attritional strategy is often criticized, especially its focus on kill counts. Critics say this approach, although gaining many tactical victories for the US, failed to address
Ty kurwy jebane
the
złodziejskie.
Vietnam struggle, the rival political legitimacy of North and South Vietnam. US leaders disregarded North Vietnam as merely a Sino-Soviet puppet, whose forces could be systematically destroyed as a hostile foreign army. But North Vietnam was largely independent and represented sincere and widespread nationalist aspirations. By wrongly attributing the conflict to external sources, the United States drastically misjudged its internal dynamics. By intervening in what was essentially a local struggle, it placed itself at the mercy of local forces, a weak client, and a determined adversary. Some US offensive operations are also of limited value and rarely develop the political legitimacy of the Southern government. Even some victories are counterproductive. For example, in May 1969, the 101st Airborne Division stormed NBA trenches on Hill 937, better known as Hamburger Hill. After 7 days of intense fighting, the 101st took the hill with 450 casualties, only to abandon it to the NBA several days later. The hill itself held little strategic value, and the battle came to typify wasteful US attacks. Or as journalist Jonathan Schell wrote, the more we won, the more we lost. Regardless, some see consistent US tactical victory as evidence the US did not lose the Vietnam War, but others question this logic. Firstly, although the US defeated every major North Vietnamese offensive and performed larger-scale search and destroy missions, most combat in Vietnam was small-scale. 96% of firefights involved less than 200 US soldiers, and the North Vietnamese instigated around 75% of all combat, giving them a distinct advantage. There is no reliable data on who won these countless small-scale actions, but the fact that the US
Dobra, teraz trzeba będzie wcisnąć kurczę bele z tym evasion, nie?
Victories are a means to political victory, not a means to an end in themselves. As Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz claimed, war is the continuation of politics, and victory comes not from killing more of the enemy, but using force to settle the political questions over which the war is fought. US battlefield successes did not prevent northern political victory, as a US negotiator in Hanoi recalled.
No to może acrobatics, but to chance to suppress spell and damage instead applied to chance to dodge spell. At 50% of the value, maximum chance to dodge is 75%.
Who ultimately takes responsibility is another hot topic. President Nixon blamed Congress, while some military leaders blamed the civilian government. In the end, we sent our sons to be maimed and crippled and to die for naught because the political leaders of this country lost their will. There was no lack of courage or skill on the battlefield. The lack of fortitude was solely in the corridors of power in Washington. As early as 1967, military officers began to complain that they were fighting with, quote, one arm tied behind their backs. President Johnson refused to allow a conventional invasion.
To też się przyda, no, można tu iść i potem... A, tu...
forces operated freely. Westmoreland understood cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail in neighboring countries
Invasion and Jersey Shield, okay.
And did try to strengthen border security, but it wasn't enough. Even when incursions into Cambodia and Laos were allowed under Nixon, they achieved little. Westmoreland and his supporters claimed the source of the attritional strategy was really President Johnson's civilian advisors, the so-called wise men.
No, tu można iść to. Blind effect.
Disastrous influence by insisting military strategy fit into new methods of quantitative analytics. It was this, they argue, not an obsession with firepower, which prioritized kill counts and an attritional strategy.
No, co nie.
Pacification efforts
Idziemy tutaj,
require
myślę.
more troops and result in lower kill counts. Some military figures, like Colonel Harry Summers, while blaming civilian leaders, also argue the Joint Chiefs of Staff provided poor strategic planning and failed to adequately brief presidents. Another argument was not lost in the jungle, but on the streets of America. Public dissent to the war certainly had an impact in pressuring U.S. leaders. Public support is critical in any war, especially limited wars in which national survival is not at stake. It's undeniable that public outrage helped end U.S. involvement, but where did it come from? One common suggestion is that the U.S. media misrepresented the war to the public.
Jeszcze totemy można by ulepszyć, no. To mi zostało jeszcze pasyw, tak to się pisze. A nie, to można sprawdzić na Path of Building, czy tam na jakimś Maxrollu, ale to chyba jeszcze mam 62, no to chyba 60 chyba tych pasywek zostało, nie?
Lurid and distorted newspaper and particularly television reporting of the Tet Offensive had transformed a devastating communist military defeat into a psychological victory. Critical U.S. reports did increase after Tet, but before Tet, coverage was largely supportive. The media often promoted optimistic government claims, and some news editors suppressed negative stories to maintain connections in the White House or to appeal to audiences. Within the Cold War context, disloyalty was considered economic suicide. But the media did play a role expanding the credibility gap between government claims and the reality in Vietnam, resulting in more anti-war sentiment. However, it has been debated how much the media created this dissent rather than reinforcing pre-existing opinions. By the time media became more critical, public opinion and civic and political leaders had already shifted the conversation and the news marketplace. In this sense, instead of developing anti-war sentiment, the media may have simply followed it as a business decision. Domestic news coverage of protests and political revelations may have also been more influential than television war coverage from Vietnam. Covering protests, publicized and normalized them.
A bez 15 minut posiedzimy i gitara się ma. No i nie wiem, może będzie ten Need for Speed albo nie.
Initially, no major news outlet would publish the My Lai massacre reporting. Overall, viewership of television network news was lower than commonly believed, and less than half of TV owners claimed to watch it. Susan Carruthers, a professor specializing in the media and war, concludes. Television may have confirmed the trend towards disillusionment, but many academics are adamant that television did not set it. Indeed, it was, in fact, considerably to its rear. Regardless of its actual impact, the idea that the media lost the war became attractive to post-Vietnam officers and affects U.S. media-military relations to this day. Some highlight media figures such as news anchor Walter Cronkite or actress Jane Fonda, who visited North Vietnam, as traitors who undermined the U.S. war effort. Others argue their impact has been grossly overstated, and instead they function as easy scapegoats for deeper military and political failures. But many of these arguments about U.S. defeat focus almost exclusively on the U.S. itself. But as the saying goes, the enemy also gets a vote. By 1975, revolutionary nationalist forces in Vietnam had already fought a series of wars over 30 years. They gained experience, but also the ideological conviction to see through the struggle. Their experiences also taught North Vietnamese leaders that strategic flexibility was essential to defeat a more powerful enemy. North Vietnam shifted regularly from conventional to unconventional operations, navigated the Sino-Soviet ideological split to their advantage, and maintained public support through regimentation and propaganda. The North Vietnamese
Regimentation, motherfuckation, taking my Asian.
North Vietnamese ones, as
Pozdro.
they generally dictated the frequency and intensity of combat. Their small-scale attritional attacks, combined with infrequent but ambitious offensives,
Kurwa, nikogo nie ma,
were
XPP.
designed to weaken U.S. public will.
Ło, jeszcze się
North
tam
Vietnamese
teleportowałem.
Commander-in-Chief Phu Nguyen Gia, who oversaw the victorious campaign against the French in 1954, understood that public will was a critical U.S. strategic weakness, one which could be targeted via the battlefields of Vietnam. The war was fought on many fronts. At that time, the most important one was American public opinion. Westmoreland did not believe in human beings, he believed in numbers. He believed in weapons and material. Military power is not the decisive factor in war. Human beings are the decisive factor. South Vietnam also played a key role in the outcome. Despite significant U.S. support, Thieu and his predecessors never seriously worked to develop state legitimacy or create a South Vietnamese identity. Its actions were undermined by the Viet Cong, but corruption, political favoritism, and elitism meant Arvin pacification efforts were ineffective at best and counterproductive at worst. Without a strong rural political base from which to develop the nation, South Vietnam was on shaky ground even with massive U.S. military support. North Vietnamese political goals were proactive and clearly identifiable for the Vietnamese population. By contrast, the U.S.'s were vague and passive. By fighting to maintain the political status quo, the U.S. locked itself into a commitment which would last as long as the North Vietnamese were willing to oppose that status quo. Although North Vietnamese morale began to suffer from 1968, it was much stronger than U.S. public morale, precisely because the stakes of victory or defeat were higher and better understood. The Vietnam War remains one of the most controversial US military actions.
Maska
Its legacy
królobójcy.
continues to impact U.S. foreign policy. After the war, some claimed a so-called Vietnam syndrome would limit future U.S. foreign interventions. A 1975 survey suggested only 36% of Americans believed the U.S. should keep commitments to other nations. But by the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan reconceptualized the war as a noble cause to restore U.S. confidence. The supposed end of the Cold War and U.S. victories in Grenada, Haiti, Panama, and the Gulf War further diminished post-Vietnam caution. By 1991, President Bush Sr. was
Ja pierdolę, wkurwia mnie ta gra już
By
powoli.
God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. The cause of the U.S. defeat was complex and multifaceted and not the doing of any single group. Debates often also ignore effective and long-developed North Vietnamese strategy, which withstood an
Ale też jest pojebane, no bo
military onslaught and may have continued
robisz
to
sobie
do so
builda
even if
i nie masz
the
go
US
w jak...
acted differently.
Wiesz, nie, wiecie, nie masz go jak go zmienić, kurde, szybko. Kurwa mać. Zajebane, bo trafiasz na jakiegoś mobka, który ma właśnie odporność na umiejętności, które szczegółowo, wiecie, tam dopieszczaliście i w ogóle. No kurwa, co to jest za... Ajajaj.
Nation of the defeat has politicized the debate as supporters of one argument look to shift the blame to others, whether it's the military, Congress, media, or anti-war groups, or deny defeat altogether. By failing to come to terms with the reality of defeat, the possibility of making similar mistakes in the future is left wide open. The media coverage of the Vietnam War was seen by millions, and iconic images like the last American helicopter to reach
Ja Czy mnie wkurwia to optymalizacja? Nie wiem, no, kurwa Wiedźmina odpalę na wysokich. Czy kurwa nic nie dzieje? Ja pierdolę.
Ground News works to aggregate news articles from a wide spectrum of news organizations to expose bias and provide a more accurate and transparent picture of what's really going on in the world. Now, whenever I'm reading the news, or history books for that matter, I keep in mind who's presenting information and what their biases might be. Importantly, it's not just what they're telling you,
Ja
but
pierdolę.
also what they're not saying. With Ground News, this insight is available in a single app and website. On Ground News, every story comes with a visual breakdown of the political bias, reliability, and ownership, all backed by 3 independent media rating organizations. For example, here's a story about the French snap elections. Over 300
Jak mi
organizations
wykurwił.
reported on this story. Of these, 37% lean left and 35% lean right. Below that, you can see the reliability and ownership information. For me, comparing sources is crucial in evaluating a story, and Ground News lets you do that at a glimpse.
Jak to będzie siedział i kurwa wszystko
But also by directly comparing
jest takie
headlines.
niszowe,
For
no ale
example,
chuj.
this right-leaning outlet notes a far-right swing and that Macron was humiliated. Another right-leaning publication states that Macron was trounced by populists. Meanwhile, on the left, this headline quotes Macron directly, urging France to make the right choice, while the BBC uses another quote, act of trust. So check out ground.news/realtimehistory or click the link below to get 40% off their Vantage plan, which is how you get unlimited access to all their features. Not only will you be smarter in how you approach the news, but you'll also support our channel. As usual, you can find all the sources for this episode in the video description below. And don't forget to watch our previous Vietnam War videos. If you're watching this video on Nebula or Patreon, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that is voluminous, lurid, and distorted.
Valley City. Come on, bro. Gah. Tagesschau in einfache Sprache.
Willkommen zur Tagesschau in einfacher Sprache. Ich bin Susanne Holst und das sind unsere 3 Nachrichten. Nach Tausch. Gefangene sind frei. München. Adele gibt Konzerte. Unwetter. Viel Regen in Deutschland. Und nun zur ersten Nachricht. Nach Tausch. Gefangene sind frei. Die Länder USA und Russland sind große Länder auf der Welt. In den USA sind einige Menschen aus Russland im Gefängnis. Und in Russland sind einige Menschen aus den USA im Gefängnis. Die USA und Russland haben jetzt eine Vereinbarung gemacht. Die USA und Russland haben gesagt, wir lassen einige von den Gefangenen frei. Die Gefangenen können in ihre Heimat zurück. Und auch Menschen aus Deutschland sind frei. Sie sind nach Deutschland zurückgekommen. Dazu kommt jetzt ein Film.
Das sind Bilder vom Flughafen in der Stadt Ankara. Die Stadt Ankara ist die Hauptstadt von dem Land Türkei. In Ankara ist ein Flugzeug aus Russland gelandet. In dem Flugzeug sind Gefangene aus Russland und dem Land Belarus. Russland und Belarus haben die Gefangenen freigelassen. Einige von den Gefangenen sind Deutsche. Die Deutschen sind mit diesem Flugzeug am Flughafen von der Stadt Köln angekommen. Am Flughafen war auch der Bundeskanzler. Der Bundeskanzler ist der Chef von der Bundesregierung. Der Bundeskanzler heißt Scholz. Scholz hat gesagt, es ist gut, dass die Gefangenen frei sind. Die Gefangenen hatten nämlich Angst um ihr Leben. Auch Deutschland hat einen Mann aus dem Gefängnis freigelassen. Der Mann kommt aus Russland. Der Mann hat einen anderen Mann in der Stadt Berlin getötet. Deshalb war der Mann in Deutschland im Gefängnis. Aber Russland hat gesagt, wir wollen den Mann zurück, sonst lassen wir keine Gefangenen frei. Jetzt gibt es auch Kritik. Manche Leute haben gesagt, wir dürfen den Mann nicht freilassen. Der Mann hat jemand anderen getötet. Die Regierung von Deutschland sagt, wir haben lange überlegt, aber wir mussten den Mann freilassen. Sonst wären die Deutschen nicht freigekommen.
Und nun zur nächsten Nachricht. München. Adele gibt Konzerte. Das hier auf dem Bild ist eine bekannte Sängerin. Die Sängerin heißt Adele. Adele kommt aus dem Land Großbritannien. Adele ist sehr erfolgreich. Menschen auf der ganzen Welt hören Musik von Adele. Adele hat viele Jahre keine Konzerte gegeben. Jetzt gibt Adele wieder Konzerte. Adele singt in der Stadt München. Adele gibt viele Konzerte in München. Und der Ort von den Konzerten ist ganz besonders. Normalerweise sind Konzerte in großen Hallen oder im Fußballstadion. Aber Adele hat ein eigenes Stadion in München. Es wurde nämlich extra gebaut. Dazu zeigen wir jetzt einen Film.
Auf diesen Bildern ist die große Bühne in München zu sehen. Auf der Bühne wird die Sängerin Adele singen. Viele Menschen werden hier sitzen und zuhören. Aber erst müssen diese Handwerker noch alles fertig machen. Die Handwerker haben die Bühne nämlich extra für die Konzerte von Adele gebaut. Das ist etwas Besonderes. Es gibt nämlich schon viele große Bühnen in München. Zum Beispiel in einer Halle oder im Stadion. Aber Adele hat jetzt ein eigenes Stadion. Dieser Mann ist der Veranstalter von den Konzerten. Er sagt, das Stadion ist besonders. Es ist ein Versuch.
Ein Versuch!
So etwas gab es noch nie. So etwas
Versuch, o prawie jak N-Word.
Adele ist auf der ganzen Welt bekannt. Adele hat lange kein Konzert gegeben. Adele singt jetzt nur in München.
Ja pierdolę, no sekunda laga i przejebane.
In einem anderen Land in Europa. Viele Menschen aus der ganzen Welt kommen deshalb zu den Konzerten nach München. Manche sagen, das ist schlecht für die Umwelt. Viele Zuschauer von den Konzerten müssen nämlich mit dem Flugzeug kommen. Manche sagen, Adele soll lieber an mehreren Orten ein Konzert geben. Und Adele soll in einer vorhandenen Halle spielen. Wenn die Konzerte vorbei sind, dann bauen die Handwerker das Stadion von Adele nämlich wieder ab.
Und nun zur nächsten Nachricht. Unwetter. Viel Regen in Deutschland. In Deutschland hat es einige Unwetter gegeben. Es hat sehr viel geregnet. Zum Beispiel in dem Bundesland Hessen. Hessen ist in der Mitte von Deutschland. In einigen Orten von Hessen waren Straßen unter Wasser. Und Wasser ist in die Häuser gekommen. Dazu zeigen wir jetzt Bilder. Diese Bilder sind aus der Stadt Trendelburg. Trendelburg ist im Norden von Hessen. Die Straßen in Trendelburg waren voll mit Wasser und Schlamm. Deshalb musste die Feuerwehr viel arbeiten. Die Feuerwehr wollte die Straßen frei machen. Der viele Regen ist auch in Häuser gekommen. Und der Regen hat in manchen Häusern Sachen kaputt gemacht. Deshalb müssen die Leute jetzt aufräumen. Das waren unsere 3 Nachrichten. Nach Tausch, Gefangene sind frei. München, Adele gibt Konzerte. Unwetter, viel Regen in Deutschland. Und jetzt kommt das Wetter. Mal scheint die Sonne und mal gibt es Wolken. An manchen Orten kann es Gewitter und Regen geben. Im Osten wird es etwas schöner. Es werden 21 bis 28 Grad. Das war die Tagesschau in einfacher Sprache. Tschüss.
Tschüss.
Zum nächsten Mal.
Zum nächsten Mal.
Willkommen zur Tagesschau in einfacher Sprache. Ich bin Susanne Holt und das sind unsere 5 Nachrichten. Hitze. Wie kann man Städte kühler machen? Gericht sagt, Wahlgesetz ist nicht fair. Elektroroller. Politiker planen neue Regeln. Erdrutsch in Indien. Es gibt viele Tote. Wettkampf abgesagt, Fluss in Paris zu dreckig. Und nun zur ersten Nachricht. Hitze. Wie kann man Städte kühler machen? Es ist gerade sehr warm. Und in Deutschland wird es immer wärmer. Das liegt am Klimawandel. Klimawandel bedeutet, die Erde wird immer heißer.
Jena.
Das ist gefährlich für die Natur.
Oh.
Gefährlich für die Menschen. Im Sommer kann es in Städten besonders heiß werden. In den Städten gibt es nämlich viele Straßen. Und es gibt viele Häuser. Die Straßen und Häuser sind aus Beton. Die Sonne scheint auf den Beton. Die Häuser nehmen die Wärme von der Sonne auf.
Ciekawe jak te marki działają.
Die Häuser geben die Wärme an die Luft.
Ten znak.
Deshalb
Proszę bardzo.
ist auch die Luft immer wärmer in den Städten. Auch in der Stadt Ludwigsburg, in dem Bundesland Baden-Württemberg. Ludwigsburg ist hier auf dem Foto zu sehen. Fachleute sagen, wir brauchen mehr Bäume und Wiesen in den Städten. Die machen die Luft nämlich kühler. Dazu zeigen wir jetzt einen Film.
In Ludwigsburg scheint gerade oft die Sonne. Es ist sehr heiß. In Ludwigsburg gibt es auch viele Plätze und es gibt viele Straßen. Sie machen die Stadt heiß. Dieser Mann ist der Bürgermeister. Er sagt, es ist zu heiß in der Stadt. Für alte Menschen ist das gefährlich. Wir müssen die Stadt kälter machen. Wiesen und Bäume sollen die Stadt kälter machen. Bäume machen nämlich Schatten. Und Wiesen machen die Luft kälter. Früher war hier ein Parkplatz für Autos. Jetzt ist hier ein Park mit Wiesen und Bäumen. Einige Menschen sagen, in viel mehr Städten soll es viel mehr Gras und Bäume geben. Und es soll weniger Straßen und Plätze geben. So wie in Ludwigsburg. Auf dieser Baustelle wird ein Parkplatz weggemacht. Danach sollen Bäume und Gras gepflanzt werden. Aber der Bürgermeister sagt, das ist schwierig. Viele wollten den Parkplatz behalten. Sie wollten nämlich parken und einkaufen gehen und ins Restaurant gehen. Die Stadt will noch mehr Parks und Wiesen machen. Aber das dauert lange und das kostet viel Geld. Die Stadt sagt deshalb, wir brauchen Geld von der deutschen Regierung.
Und nun zur nächsten Nachricht. Gericht sagt, Wahlgesetz ist nicht fair.
No i takie powinny być, a nie wyskakuje jakiś szpik tam i napierdala mnie jak pojebane.
Politiker Gesetze. Parlament heißt Bundestag. Der Bundestag ist hier auf dem Foto zu sehen. Alle 4 Jahre gibt es eine Wahl. Dann sagen die Menschen in Deutschland, diese Politiker sollen in den Bundestag. Im Bundestag sind sehr viele Politiker. Die deutsche Regierung hat gesagt, im Bundestag sind zu viele Politiker. Die Regierung hat deshalb ein neues Wahlgesetz gemacht. Das Gesetz sagt, es sollen weniger Politiker in den Bundestag.
Ja pierdolę, co się dzieje, aż mi... Jasny chuj. Ja pierdolę! Kurwa! 5 FPS-ów, GP... Kurwa jebana!
Können sie keine Gesetze machen. Deshalb sind die Politiker
Zajebista giera!
gegangen. Das Gericht heißt Bundesverfassungsgericht.
Zajebista gierka.
Das hat jetzt entschieden,
Ja pierdolę!
das neue
2
Wahlgesetz
FPS-y.
ist fair. Und wenn ein Politiker gewählt wird,
Jeszcze raz można? Chyba nie, bo... Tego co kojarzę, to ta gra właśnie jest tak dość
nun zur nächsten Nachricht.
ograniczająca
Roller,
nagrody.
Politiker planen neue
Lubi karać, ale nagrody są
Wenn man
zawsze
in der Stadt
jednorazowe.
schnell unterwegs sein möchte,
Proszę, walczymy z bossem, no
zum
to
Beispiel Fahrradfahren.
pyk, pyk, pyk.
Manche Menschen sind aber auch mit diesen Rollern unterwegs. Man kann auch sagen E-Roller. Das E steht für Elektro. Die Roller funktionieren nämlich
Się
elektronisch.
spierdno.
Es gibt aber auch Probleme.
Jezus, kto to wymyśla? Przecież jak masz kurwa chujowy komputer, to...
Manchmal auf dem Fußweg.
Pierdolę, nawet nie odpalaj tej gry.
Menschen mit Behinderungen können dann nicht mit ihrem Rollstuhl über den Weg fahren. Und auch ältere Menschen können dann dort nicht gehen. Und es gibt auch oft Unfälle mit den Rollern. Einige Menschen fahren nämlich zu schnell und passen nicht auf. Und viele Menschen fahren ohne Helm und verletzen sich. Manche Menschen sterben. Das Ministerium für Verkehr will jetzt neue Regeln für Elektroroller machen. Wenn man Elektroroller fährt, soll es zum Beispiel die gleichen Regeln geben wie beim Fahrradfahren. Und Elektroroller sollen in Zukunft Blinker haben. Das heißt, ein Licht am Roller muss zeigen, der Fahrer will nach links oder nach rechts fahren. Und nun zur nächsten Nachricht. Erdrutsch in Indien. Es gibt viele Tote. In dem Land Indien hat es einen Erdrutsch gegeben. Erdrutsch, das heißt, wenn es viel regnet, dann können Erde und Schlamm wegrutschen. Große Mengen von Schlamm können dann auch Häuser wegreißen und Menschen töten. Bei dem Erdrutsch in Indien sind jetzt viele Menschen gestorben. Die Behörden sagen, es gibt mehr als 100 Tote. Jetzt zeigen wir Bilder auf die Map. In Indien regnet es immer noch. Hier sind das Wasser und der Schlamm zu sehen. Die Arbeit ist sehr schwierig für die Helfer.
Siemanko, Pfeiffer.
Suchen nach Menschen. Die Behörden in Indien sagen, viele Menschen werden noch vermisst. Die Menschen sind vielleicht unter dem Schlamm oder unter den Bäumen.
Okej, no,
Helfer finden
kurczę.
auch immer wieder tote Menschen. Und nun zur nächsten Nachricht. Wettkampf abgesagt, Fluss in Paris zu dreckig. Bei den Olympischen Spielen in Paris ist ein großer Wettkampf abgesagt worden. Der Wettkampf heißt Triathlon. Beim Triathlon
No tak w miarę lepiej się gra.
Sportler drei Sportarten. Schwimmen,
Pedro, 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 P.
erst schwimmen die
Santa
Sportler,
Fe.
dann fahren sie Fahrrad und dann laufen sie noch. Die Sportler sollen im Fluss von Paris schwimmen. Der Fluss heißt Seine, aber es gibt ein Problem. Die Seine ist nämlich sehr dreckig. Wenn es regnet, dann kommt nämlich viel Dreck in den Fluss. Und es kommt immer wieder Dreck aus den Häusern der Stadt in den Fluss. Es fließt nämlich Dreck durch die Rohre in die Seine. Viele Menschen in Paris werfen auch Müll in die Seine. Die Behörden von der Stadt Paris haben also gesagt, wir machen die Seine sauber für die Olympischen Spiele. Jetzt kommen Bilder von dem Fluss Seine.
In Frankreich
Kurwa
sprechen
mać,
die
no.
Menschen immer wieder über dieses
Pierdolę.
Ist das Wasser
Dobra.
von dem Fluss
Dycha siadła już, kurwa.
für die Schwimmer von
Siadła i
den
płacze.
Olympischen Spielen?
Trzymajcie się.